Welcome back to Classical Mythology. In this 12th and final module, we will be looking at the emergence of a new type of hero in the later Roman period. And this is one that developed in response to religious changes that were happening in Roman society, but one that also built upon many pre-existing heroic images and patterns from the past. Now, before we get into that more specifically, we should mention the fact that there is an additional category of heroes that we could call historical heroes. These are heroic figures based on actual historical people. All the figures like Heracles and Odysseus and Achilles, these are individuals that are lost to history. You can imagine that maybe in the distant past there was some sort of living person who formed the basis of a tradition of mythological storytelling. But for the most part, that's impossible to verify. But as we get further on in the historical chronology, we start to see that certain individuals who we definitely know existed in, ancient society and subsequent societies take on a heroic status, again, usually, after their deaths because of some great deed or noble position that they try to uphold, but they're in their own category because they are heroes based on actual historical figures. One example from ancient Athens are the figures of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who killed the tyrant of the city of Athens. So they were seen as liberators of the city from autocratic rule, and then they took on a heroic status after their deaths. Other examples of historical heroes are military leaders and soldiers who fought in famous battles. So you could think of King Leonidas of the Spartans, who's famous from the episode of the 600 story told by Herodotus during the Persian Wars. Other examples are philosophers who stand up for their beliefs in the face of opposition, and they sometimes end up as executed and dying a sort of martyrdom. An example of this is Socrates, the Athenian philosopher who was accused of not worshiping the gods and, according to tradition, was forced to drink a deadly poison. Much later in the 5th century of the Common Era, we have the philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, who was killed by a Christian mob in the 5th century. Christianity itself, however, is filled with all kinds of heroic type figures, which Christianity refers to as the martyrs. And these are people who die for their belief in a cause, in this case the cause being Christianity itself. The term martyr means witness, so this is someone who is bearing witness to a set of convictions or a worldview or religious beliefs that they hold even in the face of death threats or even execution. And this is an important phenomenon in the early history of Christianity as Christianity tries to negotiate its relationship with larger Roman society, which is often hostile to the emerging movement of Christianity. So there are numerous examples of the state-sponsored killing of early Christians, which are then chronicled by Christian authors And the central figures of these stories end up becoming heroic figures. So we'll look at a couple of examples of this phenomenon from the Christian tradition, because they do in many ways build upon the pre-existing kind of heroic ethos and symbolism. And I should point out that many of the early Christian martyrs, and thus this kind of new category of hero, are women. The early Christian literature features many very prominent accounts of female martyrs. One comes from the 4th century. This is from the History of the Church by Eusebius. This is the first really surviving attempt by a Christian author to write a comprehensive history of the Christian movement. And Eusebius includes many of these martyr stories. One of the most well-known refers to the figure of Blandina, who is brought into the arena in a typical kind of martyrdom execution setting. Eusebius says, "But Blandina was suspended on a stake and exposed to be devoured by the wild beasts who should attack her." And in this kind of literature, there's often a great kind of attention to detail in the sort of trials and suffering that the martyr undergoes, and that fits with this idea of heroic suffering more broadly that we saw in the classical tradition. And because she appeared as if hanging on a cross, and because of her earnest prayers, she inspired the combatants with great zeal. For they looked on her in her conflict, and beheld with their outward eyes, in the form of their sister, him who was crucified for them, that he might persuade those who believe in him that everyone who suffers for the glory of Christ has fellowship always with the living God. Now, this is an interesting kind of reimagining of the divine aspect of the hero, just as in the classical tradition, many of these heroic figures, especially the male heroes, end up deified or venerated as divine after their deaths. There's this strong theme in the early Christian martyr literature of the martyrs imitating Christ. So Jesus himself is a sort of heroic figure who undergoes extreme suffering, and that's one of the ways that the experience of the martyrs is justified. They are imitating their Savior by undergoing similar kind of experiences of torture and execution. And martyrdom in the early Christian context is also seen as a kind of fast-tracked to the heavenly realm. By maintaining their sort of dedication to the cause, they gain this sort of immediate entry into God's presence. As none of the wild beasts at the time touched her, she was taken down from the stake and cast again into prison. She was preserved thus for another contest, that being victorious in many more conflicts, she might make the punishment of the crooked serpent irrevocable. So another type of imagery that's applied to these Christian martyrs is the imagery of warfare, and athleticism. They are the athletes and soldiers of God who were, on the front line of this cosmic struggle against evil, which is how the early Christian sort of universe is imagined. But there's also been an important reversal of values, because just as early Christian theology takes the death of Jesus as a victory, and that the crucifixion is ultimately part of God's plan to conquer evil, even though outwardly it looks like a defeat. that kind of inverted thinking is very key to the early Christian outlook. So, you know, when Christians are being arrested and sort of put on trial and tortured in public, that is their way to kind of wage war against the powers of evil who are operating in the background of Roman authorities and the government that is targeting them. And by, you know, dying, that's another act of conquest. As Eusebius uses this sort of imagery, although small and weak and despised, yet clothed with Christ the mighty and conquering athlete, she might arouse the zeal of the brethren, and having overcome the adversary many times, might receive through her conflict the crown incorruptible. And the crown here, this is the victory crown of Greco-Roman athletic competitions. And here Christ himself is referred to as an athlete. And there's very much a kind of public relations aspect to the martyrdoms where the intention, it seems, of putting these early Christians on trial and executing them in a public forum was the way of Roman authorities to sort of deter the development of Christianity, but it really seems to have had the opposite effect in many instances, that people observing these executions seem to have thought, well, you know, maybe there is something to this Christian religion if people are willing to undergo this kind of pain and torture in its name, that, you know, maybe there is some truth to it. So that's also part of the whole early Christian martyrdom ideology. And these martyrdom stories serve as the kind of foundational narratives for these historically based heroic figures. And I mean, some of the martyr accounts seem that they've been embellished or even invented, but I mean, there is a substantial number of historically based martyrdoms. But after the fact, those individuals who are now put in a new heroic category become the subject of ritual veneration at their tombs and at their shrines, just like the pre-Christian classical heroes. So another text that illustrates this sort of thing comes from the great Christian thinker Augustine in his Confessions, written in the 5th century. In Book 6, he talks about how his mother was particularly devoted to this sort of veneration of the martyrs who, you know, end up, many of them, some of the earliest saints in Christian tradition are the martyrs. But what Augustine describes here is very similar to the sort of practice you would find in the pre-Christian world. Augustine says, "When therefore my mother had at one time, as was her custom in Africa, brought to the oratories built in the memory of the saints certain cakes and bread and wine, and was forbidden by the doorkeeper, so soon as she learned that it was the bishop who had forbidden it, she so piously and obediently acceded to it, that I myself marveled how readily she could bring herself to accuse her own custom rather than question his prohibition." Now, what's interesting here is that Augustine's mother, who has now moved to the city of Milan where he's living and working, and she brings with her kind of Christian customs from North Africa, which is where Augustine grew up. And in North Africa, there's a very important cult of the saints, this ritual veneration of Christian heroes, and that involves the bringing of baked goods and bread and wine as offerings to the shrine or the tomb of the saint. But in Milan, where there's a very powerful bishop named Ambrose, he has forbidden this activity Partly it would seem because it actually resembles the pre-Christian practice of hero worship. So this sort of thing, and the continuity between the veneration of heroes in the pre-Christian religion versus the veneration of the saints. This was unsettling to some Christian authorities who didn't necessarily want to encourage any kind of continuity between the two traditions. So as much as Augustine's writing here is a kind of testimony to the existence of this sort of ritual veneration, it also speaks to the hesitation that some people within Christianity had about such practices. Now, one particularly influential kind of early Christian heroic figure, and once again we're looking at an early Christian woman, is Thecla. She was, according to tradition, a wealthy woman, or a young woman from a wealthy family who lived in the first century, so very early in the Christian kind of historical tradition, in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, but was the region in which Christianity really started to take hold early in its history. And according to the story, she's preparing to marry another member of a wealthy elite family when she hears the message of Christianity. And how she does this is she encounters the Apostle Paul, who in the first century is going through Asia Minor, preaching his version of the Christian message on his various missionary journeys. Thecla then converts to Christianity, rejects her fiancé, and takes a vow of celibacy. Now, this itself is another kind of heroic act in this early Christian tradition of heroism, to kind of renounce the norms of society around marriage and procreation and adopt a kind of religiously chaste life. Thecla then starts traveling around the Roman world, preaching the gospel, often in the company of Paul. So her story is another reflection of this new class of heroes emerging in the Roman world. As the Christian movement becomes more and more influential in Roman society, Christians develop their own category of heroes, as we've already been exploring. But this is not only the martyrs, as in the earlier example, it's also people who lived exemplary lives of holiness and virtue. So there's an aspect of their deeds are the source of their heroism, not necessarily their suffering as martyrs. But still, even in spite of the reluctance of people like Bishop Ambrose, as we saw in the passage from the Confessions, a very important tradition of ritual practice does develop within Christianity that venerates the saints and sees, their remains as objects of veneration. They are prayed to for intercession with God. They serve as a kind of as a patronage function. Their tombs and shrines also become sources of pilgrimage and provide the basis of community identity. So the same sort of motivators for people to visit, tombs of the heroes, and for local traditions about heroes to develop in the pre-Christian world, the same sort of thing is happening with Christianity. And I'm not saying this to kind of diminish this kind of tradition, because no religion comes to be completely in a vacuum. The fact is that Christianity developed in a very significant degree within Greco-Roman society, so it's completely normal that Christians would, reject some aspects of the pre-existing religious culture, but adapt and kind of reinvent others. Every new religion builds upon what came before, and it doesn't, I think, diminish the importance and significance of a practice if it can be seen to have a kind of prototype in an earlier version or context. Now, like other early Christian saints, there's a whole literature that evolved around the figure of Thecla, and shrines to Thecla that were found as important pilgrimage sites. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind that all of this sort of thing is really in many ways overlaid upon an existing culture of veneration of heroes and kind of mythological storytelling. And remember, as I said at the beginning, when we're talking about myth in this context, what we mean is sacred stories, and stories that communicate communal values and help people understand the world they live in. So that term is equally applied to something like Christianity, which has its own kind of tradition of myth making. Those myths are also connected to rituals, all of which go in combination to provide people with some sense of understanding and what they receive as a kind of truth. So just as we've been looking at these pre-Christian stories, that many of them have an important ritual aspect, people weren't engaging with these stories and visiting these temples and shrines just as kind of tourists and wanting entertainment. It meant something to them. So I think this is a useful way to kind of start to demonstrate the ongoing trajectory of myth and sacred storytelling beyond the classical world. Myth isn't just something that exists in antiquity. It is part of how human beings continue to engage with kind of things that are perceived as mysterious and beyond their understanding, and as a way to help them figure out their place in the world. So there'll be one more pre-recorded lecture, which will be kind of a summing up of themes from the course. So stay tuned for that next week.